People think the Middle Ages were a time of constant war. We see it in movies, knights in shining armor, huge armies clashing on a field, castles under siege with flaming arrows and giant catapults. It's a powerful image. It's also not quite right. The idea of one long, unending war is a myth. But that doesn't mean it was a peaceful time. The truth is more complicated. It's less about constant fighting and more about constant threat. The big famous battles we hear about, like Agincourt or Hastings, were actually very rare. As a king or a great lord would do almost anything to avoid a pitched battle. Why? Because they were a huge gamble. You could lose your entire army, your kingdom, and your life in a single afternoon. It was an all-or-nothing bet, and most rulers were not gamblers. They preferred safer, more predictable ways of getting what they wanted. So, the kind of fighting that filled most of the medieval period wasn't about glorious, decisive battles. It was smaller, messier, and much more personal. Think about it from a practical standpoint. Keeping a large army together was incredibly difficult. Armies needed to be fed, and you couldn't just order supplies from a warehouse. An army on the march had to find food as it went. This meant stripping the countryside bare. After a few weeks in one place, there would be nothing left to eat for miles around. The army would either starve or have to move on. This simple fact of logistics put a natural limit on how long a campaign could last and how big an army could be. Then there was the issue of service. In the early medieval period, a lord's army was made up of his vassals. These were knights who held land from him in exchange for military service, but this service was limited. A typical contract might require a knight to fight for only 40 days a year. After that, he was free to go home. If a lord wanted him to stay longer, he had to pay him. This made long wars very expensive. As time went on, rulers relied more and more on paid soldiers, mercenaries, but that just made the money problem even bigger. So, the Hollywood image of massive armies campaigning for years on end is mostly wrong. The war was seasonal. It happened in bursts. You fought during the summer, after the crops were planted, and before the harvest. You didn't campaign in the winter. The roads turned to mud, there was no food to be found on the land, and the weather was miserable. The war had a schedule, dictated by the seasons and the needs of farming. But just because there weren't constant, large-scale battles doesn't mean there was peace. The real story of medieval warfare is found in the small things. A local lord feuding with his neighbor over a piece of forest or a mill. Add a dispute over an inheritance that led to raids and ambushes, this kind of low-level violence was everywhere. It wasn't war in the way we think of it, with national armies and clear front lines. It was more like a constant, simmering conflict that could flare up at any time. For the average person, a peasant working the fields, the king's great war in a distant land might mean very little. They might hear rumors about it, and their taxes might go up to pay for it, but the feud between their local lord and the lord in the next valley. That was real. That was terrifying. It meant their village could be burned, their livestock stolen, and their lives turned upside down without warning. The threat of this kind of violence was the true constant. It shaped everyday life. People built their homes with defense in mind. Villages were often clustered around a church or a small fortified tower where people could run for safety. The line between peace and war was blurry. One day you were farming, the next you were hiding from armed men on horseback. This constant insecurity is closer to the truth of the medieval experience than the image of endless, epic battles. It was a world not of constant war, but of constant vulnerability. So why did they fight? If big battles were so risky and expensive, why was violence so common? The reasons were rarely about good versus evil or freedom versus tyranny, the way modern wars are often framed. Medieval wars were usually about something much more practical and personal property and inheritance. At its heart, most medieval conflict was a dispute over who had the right to control a piece of land and the people on it. Think of a kingdom not as a nation, but as a family estate. The king was the head of the family. The great lords were his relatives and powerful tenants. When a king died, the question of who would take over was often a messy one. The rules of succession were not always clear. Did it go to the oldest son? Could a daughter inherit? What if the king had no children, but a powerful nephew and a well-connected cousin? These situations were recipes for civil war. The Norman conquest of 1066 was, at its core, a succession dispute. 3 different men believed they had the best claim to the English throne. William of Normandy was just the one who won the final bloody argument. For the 100 Years' War, that epic conflict between England and France, wasn't a war between 2 modern nations. It started as a family squabble. The English kings had a claim to the French throne through marriage and inheritance. They believed France was their property, and the French disagreed. For generations, they fought over this inheritance claim. The war wasn't about Englishness versus Frenchness. It was about which branch of a large, interconnected royal family had the legal right to be in charge. This same logic applied all the way down the social ladder. A powerful duke might go to war with a count because his wife had a claim to the count's land. Two local barons might fight for decades over a single strip of riverbank because both of them had a charter from a long-dead king granting them rights to it. These weren't wars of conquest in the modern sense, where one nation tries to absorb another. They were more like violent lawsuits. Each side believed they had a legitimate legal right. The war was the means of enforcing that, right when courts and negotiations failed. Another major reason for fighting was the simple need to control your own people. A king or a lord needed to look strong. If their vassals thought they were weak, they might rebel or switch their allegiance to a rival. Sometimes, a ruler had to go to war just to prove he could. Leading a successful military campaign was a way of building prestige, rewarding your followers with loot, and reminding everyone he was in charge. It was a form of political theater, but with real swords and real consequences. Then there was the feud. This was a deep-seated part of medieval society, especially in the earlier centuries when central governments were weak. A feud was a conflict between two families or kinship groups, often started by an insult or a killing. It wasn't just random violence, it had its own unwritten rules. The goal was to restore honor. If a member of your family was harmed, you were obligated to seek revenge on the person who did it, or on their family. This could lead to a cycle of back-and-forth raids and killings that could last for generations. The feud wasn't technically war, but for the people caught in the middle, the distinction didn't matter much. It was organized violence that could erupt at any moment, and of course sometimes people fought simply for profit. As mercenary companies, groups of professional soldiers would fight for whoever paid them. When a war ended, these unemployed soldiers would often roam the countryside, robbing and terrorizing people to make a living. They became a source of violence all on their own. For them, peace was bad for business. So, the motivations for war were tangled. It was about inheritance, law, honor, power, and money. It was rarely about abstract ideas. It was almost always about gaining or defending tangible things, land, castles, titles, and wealth. This is why the violence was often limited and personal. You weren't trying to annihilate your enemy. You were trying to make them acknowledge your right to a specific castle or to force them to pay you for an insult. The war was a tool, a violent and destructive one, but a tool used to settle disputes that we would today take to a courtroom. How they fought is just as important as why they fought, and it was nothing like the orderly clashes we see in movies. Medieval warfare was mostly a slow, grinding business of destruction and exhaustion. The main goal wasn't to kill the enemy's soldiers, it was to destroy their ability to make money. It was economic warfare. The most common form of military action was not the battle, but the raid. The French had a word for it, the shivachi. This was the centerpiece of medieval strategy. An army would march into enemy territory with a very clear objective to burn everything. They would systematically torch villages, trample crops in the fields, kill livestock, and steal anything of value. The purpose was twofold. First, it terrorized the local population. Peasants would flee, and the land would become empty and unproductive. Second, it hit the enemy lord directly in his wallet. A lord's wealth and power came from the land. It came from the rents and taxes paid by the peasants who worked that land. If you burned their farms and scattered them, you cut off your enemy's source of income. You made it impossible for him to pay his soldiers or to fund his own war effort. A shivachi was brutal for the common people, but from a military perspective, it was very effective and relatively safe. You avoided risking your precious army of trained knights in a single, decisive battle. Instead, you slowly and methodically wrecked your enemy's economy. A successful campaign was one where you caused immense damage and returned home with your army largely intact. The famous Black Prince, son of the English King Edward III, was a master of this. His campaigns in France during the Hundred Years' War were essentially massive, destructive raids that crippled the French crown's ability to fight back. When armies did meet, they often spent days just looking at each other. Each commander would be waiting for the other to make a mistake. They would maneuver for the best ground, usually a defensive position on a hill where the enemy would have to charge up at them. Nobody wanted to be the one to attack first. Charging a well-prepared enemy was often suicide. This is why so many medieval battles were messy, desperate affairs. They often happened when one army was trying to retreat and got caught, or when they stumbled into each other by accident. The other major part of medieval warfare was the siege. Castles were the symbols of power and the keys to controlling territory. You couldn't control a region if you didn't control its castles, but taking a castle by force was incredibly difficult, bloody, and time-consuming. Castle design evolved specifically to make them hard to attack. They had high walls, towers, moats, and gatehouses designed to kill attackers. A direct assault on a castle was a last resort. It was a nightmare for the attackers, who would have to cross open ground under a hail of arrows, rocks, and boiling water, then try to scale the walls on ladders while defenders pushed them off. The casualties were always horrific, so attackers preferred to lay siege. This meant surrounding the castle and trying to starve the defenders out. A siege could last for months, even years. It became a contest of patience and resources. The attackers had to maintain a supply line to feed their own army, while the defenders had to hope their stored food and water would last until help arrived. During a siege, both sides would use siege engines. Attackers used catapults and trebuchets to hurl huge stones at the walls, trying to smash a breach. They would build tall wooden towers on wheels to get their soldiers up to the height of the walls. They would dig tunnels, called mines, under the walls, hoping to collapse them. Defenders, in turn, would try to burn the siege engines with fire arrows and dig their own countermines to intercept the attackers' tunnels. But even with all this technology, most sieges didn't end with a dramatic final assault. They ended with a negotiation. The defenders, running out of food and with no hope of rescue, would surrender in exchange for their lives. Or the attackers, running out of money and with winter approaching, would pack up and go home. So, the reality of medieval warfare was far from glorious. It was a business of burning farms, starving out castles, and avoiding big fights whenever possible. It was a test of logistics and economics as much as a test of arms. For the soldiers, it meant long periods of boredom and discomfort, punctuated by moments of extreme terror. For the civilians, it meant the constant fear that their world could be turned to ash and smoke by a passing army, whether that army was supposedly friendly or not. If violence was such a normal part of life, what stopped things from descending into complete chaos? Why wasn't everyone fighting all the time? There were, in fact, powerful forces that acted as brakes on war. These weren't modern ideas like international law or human rights. They were a mix of religious belief, practical limitations, and social contracts. The first, and perhaps most ambitious brake was the Church. As the most powerful institution in Europe, the Church tried to limit the brutality of medieval warfare. It couldn't stop war entirely, so it tried to regulate it. Starting in the late 10th century, it promoted movements known as the Peace of God and the Truce of God. The Peace of God was a set of rules about who could be attacked. It declared that certain people were off limits to violence: clergy, pilgrims, merchants, women, children, and peasants. It also protected their property, like farm animals and tools. The idea was to shield the unarmed people, the ones who couldn't fight back, from the horrors of war. The Truce of God was about when you could fight. It tried to forbid warfare on certain days and during certain seasons. You weren't supposed to fight on Sundays, the day of the Lord. You weren't supposed to fight on religious holidays like Easter or Christmas. Eventually, they tried to extend the ban from Wednesday evening to Monday morning. The goal was to create long periods of mandatory peace throughout the year. Now, did these movements work perfectly? Of course not. Knights and lords ignored the rules all the time, but they were not a complete failure either. They created a powerful ideal. The church could use its ultimate weapon, excommunication, to punish those who broke the truce. Being excommunicated meant you were cast out of the church, unable to receive the sacraments, and it was believed your soul was damned to hell. For a medieval ruler, this was a serious threat, both spiritually and politically. It gave his enemies a religious excuse to attack him. The peace and truce of God didn't end war, but they did help to establish the idea that there should be limits to violence. The second major break was money. War was ruinously expensive. A knight's equipment alone, a war horse, armor, weapons, cost a fortune, as much as a small farm. A king who wanted to raise an army had to find a way to pay for it. He could try to raise taxes, but this was often unpopular and could lead to rebellion. He could borrow money from bankers, but he would have to pay it back with interest. Many medieval kings were deeply in debt. The sheer cost of putting an army in the field and keeping it there was the single biggest factor limiting the scale and duration of wars. Many campaigns ended not because of a great victory or defeat, but because the king simply ran out of cash. The logistics of paying and feeding an army were a constant headache that brought many military ambitions to a halt. Third, There was the rhythm of the seasons. Medieval society was overwhelmingly agricultural. Everything revolved around the farming calendar. You planted in the spring, you harvested in the fall. These were times when you needed every able-bodied person in the fields. A lord who called his peasants away to fight during harvest time was risking starvation for his entire domain. This created a natural campaigning season. Wars tended to start in the late spring after planting and wrap up by autumn, before the weather turned bad and the harvest had to be brought in. Chinese winter was a time of forced peace. The practical realities of an agricultural world put a powerful natural check on how long people could fight. Finally, the very structure of feudal society limited warfare. A lord's power was based on a network of personal oaths. A knight swore an oath to his lord, promising to fight for him. But as we've seen, this service was usually limited to a set number of days per year, often 40. After that, the knight's obligation was fulfilled. He could pack up his gear and go home, and there was nothing the lord could legally do about it. This made it very hard to keep an army together for a long campaign. An army could literally melt away in the middle of a war as its soldiers' terms of service expired. To fight longer wars, rulers had to turn to mercenaries, but this just brought them back to the problem of money. These four factors, the church, money, the seasons, and the feudal contract, all worked together to limit war. They prevented the medieval world from becoming a non-stop, total war of all against all. They ensured that war, while common, was usually limited in its scope, its duration, and its intensity. So, what was it like to live in this world? If it wasn't constant, total war, was life for the average person mostly peaceful? The answer is no. For most people, the problem wasn't the frequency of declared wars, but the constant gnawing insecurity. The line between peace and violence was so thin it was barely there at all. For a peasant farmer, the great dynastic struggles of kings and emperors were distant affairs. The news might arrive months later, distorted by rumor. The king's war was an abstract thing that meant higher taxes or a demand for grain. What was truly terrifying was local violence. Your own lord might get into a feud with the baron in the next valley over the rights to a stream. For the two lords, this might be a matter of honor and income. For the peasants living on that land, it was a disaster. It meant the possibility of a nighttime raid. It meant waking up to the smell of your neighbor's barn burning. It meant armed men on horseback trampling your crops, stealing your only cow, and maybe hurting your family. This kind of localized violence was an accepted part of the social fabric. A lord's right to wage a private war to settle a dispute was a recognized privilege for much of the period. The central government, whether a king or an emperor, was often too weak to stop him. Justice was something you often had to make for yourself, and for the nobility that meant using force. This put the common person in a state of permanent vulnerability. You were completely dependent on the power and temperament of your local lord. If he was strong and kept the peace, you might live your whole life without seeing violence. If he was weak or aggressive and quarrelsome, your life could be a living hell. Even an army that was supposedly on your side was a threat. Armies lived off the land. When a friendly lord and his soldiers passed through your village, they needed to be fed. They would take your food, your grain, and your livestock. They would demand shelter. This was called purveyance, and while it was technically legal, it felt a lot like robbery. An army, any army, was like a swarm of locusts that devoured everything in its path. The arrival of soldiers, even your own, was a cause for fear, not celebration. This constant threat shaped the physical world. People didn't live in isolated farmhouses if they could help it. They clustered together in villages, often within sight of a fortified place, a castle, a walled town, or even just a strong stone church tower, where they could flee for safety. The landscape was dotted with these points of refuge. Travel was dangerous. Forests and lonely roads were known to be haunts for bandits and outlaws, many of whom were former soldiers who had been left unemployed when a war ended. So, while a historian looking at records might see long periods of official peace between kingdoms, an individual living in that time would have experienced something very different. They lived with a low-level hum of potential violence. It was a world where a personal insult between two nobles could lead to a burned village. A world where the local legal system was often just the will of the strongest man in the area. A world where your security depended entirely on the strength of your protector and the whims of your neighbors. The medieval period was not one constant war. It was a series of interruptions. There were long stretches of peace, but peace was fragile. It was a temporary state, easily broken. The real constant was not the act of fighting, but the assumption that fighting could break out at any moment over any issue at any level of society. It was the normalization of violence as a tool for getting things done. For the people at the bottom, who had no say in these disputes but suffered all the consequences, this made life precarious and uncertain. That feeling of insecurity, of never knowing when the world might be turned upside down, is the true legacy of warfare in the Middle Ages.